Welcome to Life Quantum Action. This podcast is for people who already know the work and are learning how to live it. We talk about identity, business, money, leadership, and what it actually takes to stay with who you're becoming when life applies pressure. I'm Carly, and I am so glad that you're here. In fact, I'm really glad to be here today. And I'm recording and very likely releasing this episode earlier than planned. And I had been working this morning, finished up my day at 12 o'clock, went into my bedroom, got myself changed, ready for the gym, and I was literally putting my shoes on at the door when I turned around and I was like, no, I am going to record this episode now while I'm feeling this fire in my belly, while I am feeling so incredibly passionate and just ready to speak this into existence by way of another episode. And also, I am not the person who sits around and waits for the perfect time. I make the time perfect. So that's what we're doing here today. So I want to talk about something that I think a lot of people in this space have probably very quietly felt, maybe not said out loud or very rarely said out loud. And that is that feeling. That is that feeling when you have tried all of the manifestation work, you have really tried to do all of the things that all of the gurus and the experts have told you to do, yet it still hasn't quite landed the way that you hoped. So you've done the visualizations, you have written the affirmations, you have stood in your mirror and told yourself, I'm that bitch. You've tried to stay high vibe, and maybe you have done a few little random rituals as well. And you've tried to stay high vibe. That's probably the part that I want to come back to here. And despite your best efforts, there have been days when you didn't feel high vibe, and you have probably felt really guilty on those days, because if you're not feeling high vibe, then you're not going to manifest what you want. Isn't that what we're told? You have to be high vibe. You have to, positive vibes only, right? And then somewhere along the way, you started wondering, am I just doing this wrong? Why does it seem to work for other people, but it doesn't work for me? And the reason that I want to talk about this is because I have been there. I have completely been there. And this episode is all about, I guess, what actually changed for me. And I want to share it with you, not as theory and, as a concept, but as pure lived experience, and something that I have, hand on my heart, walked through so many different times. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about the law of attraction, right? That's what this episode is called, from law of attraction to law of assumption. And like most people, the law of attraction was my first sort of exposure to this world that we know as manifestation, okay? And also, like most people, I found this law of attraction work, through The Secret. You might remember the book, the movies, and all the things. And at that time, oh my gosh, it felt like such a revelation. The idea that your thoughts and your energy can create your reality, and that what you focus on, you attract, and all of these things. But what I didn't actually realize in that moment was that I was approaching it almost like a prayer, right? And if you were looking at me right now, you would see me with my hands in the prayer position and about to get on my knees. But it was I felt like I had to prove that I was worthy of receiving what I wanted. And if I was good enough, if I was grateful enough, if I was high vibe enough, then just maybe it would come. And so I was monitoring everything. I was constantly monitoring my moods. I was monitoring my thoughts, and that part hasn't changed, which I'll talk more about later. But, if I had a moment of doubt or a moment of frustration, then I would try to catch myself and then try to course correct. But I would also feel really down on myself, like if I wasn't high vibe enough, because what if having a negative feeling was the thing that was going to block me from actually getting the thing that I wanted, right? So I got into this place where I was really beating myself up if I wasn't, quote unquote, doing it right. So rewind a few years, and I remember trying to sell my house, and I was trying to sell my house in what I thought was the peak of the property market. But, looking at it a few years down the track, it probably wasn't the peak, but it was certainly a pretty hot property market. And, we'd been trying to sell it for a number of weeks. And I remember someone telling me, she was like, write down the number that you want on a bay leaf. And then I think it was burn the bay leaf or bury the bay leaf. I can't remember exactly. But, write down the number you want on a bay leaf. Let's just say it was burn it, and then it'll happen, right? So, of course, what do you think I did that night? I got out a bay leaf, I got my black Sharpie, and I wrote the number, the dollar amount that I wanted to get for selling my house. I did it. I did the ritual, right? And then I waited and I waited and I waited. And as I said, the market was hot. And we started getting offers, but they were pretty low. Then we got one offer that was like, the offer that we wanted, then they called off. And long story short, it took 5 weeks in a market where houses were selling literally in days. Eventually it sold, and it was pretty close to that number that I had written on that bay leaf. So did the ritual work? Did the bay leaf ritual work? Did I get what I wanted for my house because I had written it down with a black Sharpie on a bay leaf? Well, here's what I think now. I think that the ritual worked to an extent because I assumed it would. I expected that would work. And so I put my faith in that completely, and I expected to get that outcome. And that right there, that's the entire shift that I want to talk about today. Because I wasn't doing law of attraction at that point. I was accidentally doing something else. And you might even sort of know or have heard of some other different rituals. There were moon rituals, like, some people say like you only manifest on a new moon, right? Or you must wait for the Lionsgate portal, the 8th of the 8th. You make wishes at 11:11 every day. And I want to be mindful here because I'm not saying that these things are wrong. By no means am I saying that these things are wrong. What I am saying is that no matter what meaning we give something, we will find evidence for that to be the truth. So if you assume that the 8th of the 8th or the Lionsgate portal is powerful, then it is. Because your assumption is the thing that is always doing the work. And so we're manifesting in every single moment. But maybe you're not consciously manifesting just yet, or maybe you're not realizing that you're manifesting in every moment. I want to share a story of how my life looked a few years ago. And my life looked very different a few years ago. It looked nothing like it looks now. And so I think we're going back to 2022 when my husband at the time and we sold everything. We sold our house, as I've just shared. We sold all of our furniture. We sold most of our possessions. And we bought a car. We bought a caravan and a car to tow it, right? The car's the minor detail, but we bought a caravan and we set off to travel Australia. We set off to chase the sun and live out what had become a big dream of ours to see Australia, right? And so we set off into the sun with our little girl who was 4 at the time and our bull-fed dog, thinking that, or, hoping that I guess we would experience this shift in our lifestyle that we'd both been wanting. Now, our relationship had been in struggle town for some time back then, and I think we both went into this trip thinking that it was going to fix it, right? Thinking that it was going to solve all of the challenges that we weren't actually addressing, right? You know how that goes. And so it was about 7 months in, things were things were not necessarily improving at all. In fact, some might say that collapsing your entire life into a 21-foot caravan might even exacerbate any challenges that you do have, right? Which is exactly what we found. And so we were living in Byron Bay at the time when I made the call, and we spent a number of months living between the caravan and hiring out a cabin every night. So one of us would stay in the caravan and one of us would rent out a cabin for the night. And we basically just kind of like kept having to check out of cabins and then move into new cabins and chop and change, right? And so yeah, it was just the two of us with our newly made decision to separate, living in very close proximity with, of course, our daughter and our doggo. And so there was this period of like, okay, what are we going to stay here? Are we going to go back to Adelaide? What are we going to do, right? So we ended up packing up and driving back to our hometown where, you know, again, we had sold our house. We had sold all of our things. So it was kind of like, right, we're coming back to Adelaide most likely purely for the support, you know, our support network, our family, our friends. You know, it wasn't like we'd really had anything else here. And so we spent a number of months trying to sort of navigate what life was going to look like going forward. And on paper, you know, I'm like reading my notes here about this scenario, and it's like you look at it on paper and everything had collapsed. Like everything had collapsed. But in that moment, something else was happening. And I didn't know it at the time, but it's only upon the deep reflection that I've done that I have this awareness now. And that thing that happened was that for the first time in a long time, I had space. You know, I had space to actually start to sit with this work, right? This work that I had been sort of, I guess, like dipping my toes in and out of, dabbling in and out of. But I had the space to actually sit and really, really do this work. So I did a course on the law of assumption and really started to understand it more. Really made that commitment to myself that, like, you know what, if I am going to change my life and stop repeating patterns, you know, all of the patterns that had got me to that point, then I really need to look at my self-concept. I really need to understand who I am being, who I have been being. Have a look at all of the stories that I'd been running about abandonment, about not being good enough, about what I thought I deserved and what I thought I didn't deserve, like what I thought was actually reserved for people, not like for people other than me. And I looked at all of these stories that I didn't even know were there, and I dove so deep. And these stories and these patterns had just been quietly running underneath everything, ruling my life and shaping every single decision that I made, and therefore shaping every single result that I was getting. And so with this new knowledge about the law of assumption, this new knowledge about myself and how I hadn't really been willing, you know, it's really interesting. I say that I finally had the space to look at all of these things, but what an interesting excuse, because if we're committed and if we really desire to do that work, there is always the time and there is always the space. But anyway, so I really started to rewrite these stories very consciously and very deliberately. And so I started creating these scripts about how I wanted to, like what I wanted to believe about myself, how I wanted to be experienced, how I wanted to be perceived, how I want to feel. And I started doing affirmations like pretty fucking religiously. And every single night I would go to bed. So this is from basically from when we left Byron Bay. I still even remember some of the places that I remember all of the places we traveled to on our way back to Adelaide. And I even remember like some of the moments that I had by myself and what I was thinking and what I was feeling. And yeah, there was a really big moment. It was a really big moment. And so from then I would go to bed every single night, and I had created this like little 20-second movie in my mind. And I would go to bed every single night for a period of time laying next to my ex-husband. And I would replay this little movie in my mind. And that movie was living in the suburb that I wanted to be living in, where I had previously lived a number of years before. Living in the suburb I wanted to be living in an apartment with my daughter. And the movie was basically me and her opening the door to our new apartment and walking in, right? That was it. I could see the door handle. I could see the keys. I could see her little head, and I could see her running, right? And I just like kept repeating that over and over again each night as I was going to sleep. And in those moments where I was playing this little movie in my mind, I had no idea how it was going to happen. I had no idea how or when, but I just knew it would happen. And this is often the mistake that a lot of people make. And kind of digressing a little bit here from the story, but this mistake that a lot of us make is trying to figure out the how. We try to get into the logical space, and we have this hierarchy of events that we think needs to happen before the thing that we want can actually happen. And so that was probably the first time that I had actually committed to just fucking letting go of the how and going, you know what, this is right now, this is out of my hands. I fucking live there. And so there was a suburb that I was drawn to, right? There was a suburb that I wanted to live in. I knew that I wanted to live there. So the other thing that I was doing is I would drive there, right? So there was a period where I was living at my parents' house for a little while the dust was settling. I would drive there. I would drive to this suburb, and like not necessarily to look at properties or anything, but just to literally drive the streets. I would park my car. I would walk along the river, and I was just acting like I already lived there. I was acting like I already lived there, but then came the inevitable moment of each time I did that drive was that I would need to drive back to my parents' house. And that felt really hard. That felt really challenging. And it wasn't because I doubted that I was ever going to live there. I knew that I would. That wasn't the issue. But the issue for me was the gap between what I knew within myself and what my external 3D reality was actually showing me. And so there was this big lesson around actually living inside that gap and not letting it shake my assumption. So living in that gap where I had to drive back home to my parents' house where I didn't want to be living. Sorry, Mum and Dad, I love you. But not letting that derail what I believed and what I desired. And that is the work. That's the work. And this is a big piece that not a lot of people talk about, but honestly, it is one of the most commonly asked questions that I get. Carly, how do I believe this when my 3D reality is showing me this? How do I believe that I'm going to get what I want when I can't see how it's going to happen? And that is the gap where most people reset. And it's not necessarily because they stop believing, but it's because their 3D is showing them the old story. And because we experience the 3D with our senses, we can touch it, we can taste it, we can hear it, we can see it. At some point, that old story feels more real than the one that they've been assuming. And I stayed in that gap for months. I stayed in that gap for months. Until the point came where I saw an apartment that I wanted to live in. I applied for that apartment. I walked in with my daughter to that apartment, and I shit you not, there were probably 30 groups of people in there. We're in the middle of a rental crisis. I'm a newly single mum. I'd burned my business down to the ground whilst trying to navigate the rest of life and just, really just being in survival mode at that point. And I got the apartment. And I still remember, I remember like looking in the apartment and feeling like, yeah, okay, fine, this is perfect, all good. We were literally in here for not even 5 minutes, having a really quick look. Walked out, spoke to the guy. He's like, do you want to apply for it? And I'm like, yes, let me know the deed. Like, how do I do it? Yep, all good. And I heard his voice because he was talking to me. And so then for the next few nights, I added a little piece to my movie. And that was hearing him on the phone saying, hey, I've got some really good news for you. And when that phone call came, he said, hey, I've got some really good news for you. Now, I've been in this apartment for just over 2 years now. And what I want you to understand about this story is that this apartment didn't happen just because I did a few rituals. It didn't happen because I waited for the right moon phase or because, I had like written down what I wanted on a bay leaf and burned it. It happened because I had really committed to doing the identity work, that I had genuinely stopped assuming that I was someone who didn't get to have that. And instead, I internally became the woman who, of course, lived there. And so by that point, because I believed it so fucking hard, the rest was just, it was like it was just a formality. So there wasn't a lot of surprise or shock, like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. I mean, there was a little undertone of that, but ultimately I knew. And so here's the shift from the law of attraction to the law of assumption, and I'll put it as simply as I can. Law of assumption, at least the way that most of us were taught it anyway, says you got to feel good, you got to stay high vibe. If you ask the universe and you're good, the good things will come to you. And basically the way that I interpret that is that the moment you feel bad, you're doing it wrong. And if you're doing it wrong, you're not going to get what you want, right? That's how I interpret it. And what I found, and what you may have found too, is that you end up spending more energy trying to manage how you're feeling than actually living your life and actually spending time assuming that you are the person who gets to have what you want. And the law of assumption says something quite different. It says whatever you most dominantly assume to be true about yourself, other people, the world, about your life, is what will harden into reality. Not what you hope for, it's not what you wish for, but it's what you assume. And to me, what that means, and this is the part that changed everything for me, is that you are always manifesting. And so I've had moments in my life where I would avoid looking at my bank account because I didn't want to feel the lack. But I was manifesting. I was assuming that lack was there and that needed to be avoided. And on the other hand, when I drove those streets like I already lived there, I was manifesting because I was assuming that was already mine. Now the bay leaf, bringing back the bay leaf, that worked because I assumed it would. That apartment became mine because I had become someone who assumed that I fucking deserved it. And so this work isn't about finding the right technique. It's not about, finding the best rituals and the 369 method and all of the things, which again, no shade, but it is about looking honestly at what you are actually assuming underneath those rituals, underneath those affirmations, underneath the surface. And you deciding if that's the story that you want running your life. Because the stories and the patterns that are hidden deep in the subconscious, they are the ones that are ruling your life. Okay. If this episode has brought anything up for you, don't feel the need to rush to fix it or necessarily do anything with it immediately. Okay? Just take a moment to notice. Where have you been trying to manifest from a place of worthiness or, kind of performing the work rather than assuming the outcome? And where have you actually been assuming something, probably pretty quietly, underneath it all, and watching that show up? Because that awareness, that is what will start to shift things. Now, if you want to go deeper with this, I have created a free audio called Stay, which is an identity stabilization audio, which is made exactly for this in-between space. It's made exactly for that gap between what you know internally and what your 3D is showing you, and where you might feel tempted to tap out rather than to lean in. Okay, now the link to that is in the show notes. And otherwise, I will see you in the next episode.